Hela, hur är det, and welcome back to the channel. Once again, we're back on the language overviews where I go in-depth talking about everything you need to know about one language, and today we're talking about Swedish. I've got some Swedish friends, so hopefully they like this, and yes, since it was a hot topic in a previous comment section, one of them is from Stockholm, although I personally have only visited the southern part of Sweden to this point. Nonetheless, the default dialect in this video will probably end up being Stockholm. Without wasting too much time, let's go! First off, let's look into the history of the language. Swedish, or svenska, is a North Germanic language in the Indo-European language family. As a North Germanic language, it descends from Old Norse, the language of some people you may have heard of called the Vikings. Old Norse started in around 600 AD in this general area, which includes parts of modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and then spread through conquest to a broader area. Then, sometime between 800 and 1100, there became a dialectal distinction between two varieties of Old Norse which we now know as Old West Norse and Old East Norse. For this video, we care about Old East Norse because it's what resulted in Danish and Swedish, as well as Gutnish and Elfdalian. In the 1200s, though, the two dialects got further apart, and this leads us into the Old Swedish period, which lasted until the 1500s. Within Old Swedish, there were two periods, Early Old Swedish and Late Old Swedish. Late Old Swedish, which started in about 1375, is split apart because it's when the grammatical and phonological changes happened that moved Swedish away from Old Norse. Following this, in 1526, just 3 years after the dissolution of the Kalmar Union, Swedish King Gustav Vasa commissioned a Bible translation known as the Vasa Bible, which is considered the basis for standardized modern Swedish, based on the speech in Sweden at that time. This began early modern Swedish, which became late modern Swedish in the 1700s. Surprisingly though, modern Swedish is not technically the current variety. That's ny svenska, or now Swedish, sometimes called contemporary Swedish in English, and it includes recent changes in the language, in particular the complete loss of formality. Today, Swedish is the official and majority language of Sweden, as well as the autonomous Finnish territory of Åland. It's also official in Finland, even though only just under 300,000 people there speak it. Overall though, about 10 million people speak Swedish natively, and about 3 million speak it as an L2, totaling approximately 13 million speakers. Now that we're past that, it's time for Swedish phonology. Overall, Swedish has 17 vowels and 18 consonants, totaling 35 phonemes, and the closest I've ever seen to the vowels tying the consonants in number, for now. Here, I'll talk about the vowels first because that 17 count is somewhat subject to interpretation. Swedish has phonemic vowel length distinction, and there are only 9 base vowels, but each of them has some form of quality change in the 2 lengths. Also, it's only 17 because 2 of the short vowels have now merged, so it's technically 8 short vowels and 9 long ones. And since this is Swedish, there are definitely some rare vowels, but the ones probably the most unfamiliar to non-Swedes would be U, and Ö. In addition, E is pronounced closer to I in real life. It should also be mentioned that only stressed vowels can be long. The stress in Swedish, at least in Germanic words, is always found on the first vowel of the root, not the word. So if there's certain prefixes, like in behöva, the be prefix isn't stressed. Swedish does not have vowel reduction, but in terms of allophones, some of the vowels are pronounced further open when before r. Now about the consonants, and firstly, their allophones. Like in most of the Germanic languages, the voiceless plosives bete and ke get aspirated at the beginnings of words. Examples are padda, talk, and cool. Also, r, which is subject to the most regional variation of any Swedish consonant, has an allophonic form in front of alveolar consonants that varies by region. In southern Sweden, it becomes the voiced uvular trill r, while in northern Sweden it disappears but makes the consonant after it retroflex, meaning the tongue curls and the bottom of it touches the roof of the mouth. An example of this would be örn, or in the south, örn. Also, because of this system, this actually raises the consonant count in northern Sweden to 23, meaning they have 40 total phonemes. And since I was just throwing around terms like uvular and retroflex, what better time is there to talk about their rare consonants? Swedish has 2 main ones, and they are the voiceless alveolo-palatal fricative sh and this thing, which is the most characteristically Swedish sound there is, and it has a lot of dialectal variations, so regardless of what I call it, people in the comments will get mad. So I'll say it's like a voiceless palatavelar fricative pronounced ch. That reflects what I normally hear anyways. Finally, for consonants, much like the vowel length distinction, Swedish has consonant gemination distinction for consonants at the end of the root. But it gets more interesting than that. The vowels and consonants work in tandem with each other so that if a root syllable has a short vowel, it'll have a geminated consonant after it, while if the vowel in the root syllable is long, then the consonant after it will be ungeminated or possibly non-existent. Finally, for Swedish phonology, we have a concept that some of y'all are probably dying for me to talk about. Swedish has pitch accent. The pitch accent in Swedish affects the syllables immediately following the stress, and they can be either high or low. The example I gave in that other video about Germanic sound shifts, linked in the description box, was the phonemic difference between anden, the duck, and unden, the spirit. I've seen it represented in many ways in IPA, such as with a second stress mark, a tilde over the first syllable, and even superscript numbers 1 and 2, 2 being the high pitch, but the one I like to use is simply the acute, which represents high pitch or tone in IPA, over the affected vowel. The difficult part of Swedish pitch accent is that it's not represented in the orthography, giving me the idea that it primarily exists as an easy way for Swedes to pick out foreigners. Thankfully though, there are patterns to it that you can learn, and I'll link to a great video in the description box that explains this in full detail. I actually learned of its existence in the comment section of the Germanic sound shifts video, so thank you to the commenter for that. Speaking of the orthography, now it's time for that. Let's talk about Swedish writing. Swedish uses its own version of the Latin alphabet with 26 letters. Of those, there are 9 vowels and 17 consonants. Outside of 26, the letters Q, W, and Z can also be found, albeit in very few loanwords. First off, the tandem between the length of vowels and the consonants after them is represented in Swedish orthography, but only by the consonants. A single consonant indicates both a long vowel and an ungeminated consonant, while a double consonant indicates vice versa. This is shown in the difference between fat with a long vowel and fat with a short vowel. If you speak another Germanic language like English or Dutch that has a system where the vowel length distinction is shown in multisyllabic words by the number of consonants after it, you probably just had an aha moment. Yep, the system used to be more widespread. There is an orthographic exception here though. If the k sound gets geminated, then it'll be written ck, like in nickel. In fact, c only exists in digraphs in Swedish, except for in some Romance loanwords where it's pronounced s, like in centrum. The only other digraph of it is ch, which appears pretty much just in loanwords like choklad, where it's pronounced ch or sh, but there's also the word for and, ok, where it's either pronounced k or dropped, breaking the previous rule. Speaking of digraphs, Swedish has a few of them, and most of them are just used for making the 2 rear phonemes mentioned earlier. Specifically, these combinations are said sh, and these combinations are said ch. In addition, due to even more cluster simplifications that have happened in Swedish's recent history, these combinations are all just pronounced ye. Finally, ng is pronounced ng, and on a similar note, the digraph gn results in the interesting cluster of ng, like in the word ring. Anyway, now we'll talk about letters that change their sound based on environment. In native Swedish words, before any front vowel, k is pronounced sh like in shut, and g is pronounced ye like in jespa. In addition, the cluster sk is pronounced ch in the same conditions like in skicka. Finally, I'll just talk about diacritics for the fun of it. As y'all have probably picked up by now, the diacritics mostly just distinguish letters, namely ä and ö with the diaresis, or trema, and å with the ring, or as I like to call it, the halo. However, there is one other seldom used diacritic in Swedish, and it's the acute, or acute, on ä, which is used primarily in French loanwords and indicates that stress goes there like in mosquée. Also, before moving on, capitalization in Swedish is used at the beginnings of sentences and proper names. Now we're on to the grammar, starting with the sentence structure. The default word order in Swedish is SVO, or subject, verb, object. For a basic example, we have Valen äter fiskar i havet. This means the whale eats fish in the sea. Word for word, we have subject, verb, object, predicate, SVO. However, this isn't always the case, as there are 2 situations in which the structure can effectively become VSO instead. For one, like in many European languages, questions are VSO in Swedish. So our example sentence as a question would be Äter valen fiskar i havet? The other situation in which Swedish sentences become VSO is if the sentence begins with an adverbial phrase. Yep, as is typical among Germanic languages, Swedish has the concept known as V2 restriction, which is the syntactic rule that the verb must be the second constituent in the sentence. For those of y'all who haven't taken syntactic theory in college, a constituent in linguistics is a part of the sentence that acts as a single unit or phrase that can't be separated in languages with flexible word order, and not a person represented by an elected official. That's something else. Basically, in languages with V2 restriction, normally you would have the subject as the first constituent and the verb as the second, and everything's all good. But if you instead have an adverb as the first constituent, the rule states that the verb still needs to be the second constituent. This pushes the subject into the third position after the verb. To show this, our example sentence with an adverb would be Varje dag äter valen fiskar i havet. Every day the whale eats fish in the sea. Every day is a single constituent. The hard part about this rule, in my opinion, is that it applies to adverbs but not conjunctions. So if you're starting a sentence with min or then V2 doesn't apply since the conjunction isn't really part of that clause or something. Anyway, the other rules of Swedish word order. Adjectives and all numbers go before their nouns. Supplemental nouns go before the main noun and compound onto it, in fact, and Swedish uses prepositions, the ones that go before the noun phrase. Finally, Swedish is an anti-drop language, so the subject pronouns must be included in the sentence. Now let's talk about the nouns. Swedish nouns are inflected for 2 numbers, singular and plural, as well as 2 genders. And if you were guessing, you got this wrong. The genders in Swedish are common and neuter. Basically what this is that Old Swedish had a 3-gender system of masculine, feminine, and neuter. However, throughout the modern Swedish period, the masculine and feminine merged into each other, forming the common gender, while the neuter was left alone. It's not the same as an animate-inanimate system. Swedish still has arbitrary gender assignments. Unfortunately, most of the time there's no indication on the noun which gender it is, so you just have to learn the gender alongside the noun. The only times you can tell are 2 historically feminine patterns, which means that they're modern common nouns. First, the suffix ing like in aning and klänning, and second, the suffix a like in ugla and stjärna. But it should be mentioned that there are 3 frequent exceptions to this second rule, all found among the body parts, öga, öra, and hjärta, which are neuter. Anyway, pluralizing nouns depends partly on the gender. Neuter nouns are mostly pretty easy, you just don't do anything to them, like hus to hus and morn to morn. Common nouns are a bit harder. Most of them pluralize with the suffix ar, like spar to sparvar and björn to björnar. However, some of them pluralize instead with and this is random. Examples are katt to katter and get to getter. Thing is, as a Germanic language, this can also sometimes be accompanied by a vowel change on the root. For example, stad to steder and bok to böcker. In fact, sometimes the plural is made only by changing the vowel, like in man to men and gos to yes. This is all, of course, the Germanic concept of umlaut. Anyway, back to the patterns. The historically feminine nouns have their own pattern. Their plural suffix is ur, like in ugla to uglor and herna to hernor. Two of the aforementioned neuter a words do a similar thing, in fact, as we have öga to ögon and öra to öron, but hjärta does its own thing, becoming hjärtan in the plural. And that's just about it for the plurals. The only thing left for the nouns is the genitive case. It's the only case inflection that Swedish has, and it's very easy to make. You simply put the suffix s onto the modified noun to show possession. Now it's time for the articles, and I pretty much have to do this section after the nouns because in Swedish, the articles wouldn't make any sense without first knowing how nouns work. Swedish has definite and indefinite articles, but they work differently from each other. They're also inflected for gender and number. While the indefinite articles are words that precede the noun phrase, the definite articles are effectively the same morphemes but as a suffix on the noun. Here's the table of them. In the singular, the common nouns take en and the neuter nouns take et. In the plural, the already pluralized common nouns take na as the suffix, indefinite articles aren't really a thing in the plural, and the neuter nouns take n. Yeah, it's the same as the singular common nouns. Other things that should be mentioned. The n suffix also goes on all irregular plurals, like how the men is mennen. It also just become one letter n in a couple cases. One, if the noun ends with a, like in herna to hernan. And two, if there's a weak syllable with like l or n at the end of a noun, like how nyckel becomes nyckeln when definite and pluralizes to nycklar. The same thing can happen to neuter nouns. For example, water is vatten while the water is vattnet. But the definite articles get even more complicated if there's an adjective in the noun phrase. In this situation, the suffix stays on the word, but an additional article gets added before the adjective. This article is den for common nouns, det for neuter nouns, and de for all plurals. For example, the red car is den röda bilen, while the red floor is det röda golvet, and the red cars is de röda bilarna. From these, we also get the Swedish demonstratives, which are respectively denna, detta, and dessa. Oh, and you want to know something super frustrating? Swedish's close relative Danish has a similar system, but in Danish, you do drop the suffix. When I'm speaking one of these languages and I approach a phrase like this, I always have to consciously remind myself which language I'm speaking before I say the noun. So, since we just saw the demonstratives, why not the ordinary pronouns now? Here's just a big chart of them, and we'll see what we notice. First off, Swedish has an impersonal third-person pronoun, which is man in subject form and means one, so why not reuse the example from the French video? One does not simply go to someone's house to ransack the fridge. You'll also notice in the third-person pronouns that the pronouns are different for humans and non-humans, 2 sets for each. In addition, there's possibly a non-binary pronoun, han, but it's a neologism whose legitimacy isn't quite agreed upon by the Swedish-speaking community. There's also a reflexive pronoun, say, in object form. Oh, and yeah, by the way, may, de, and say are not pronounced how they're spelled. They all end with a, not really e. Now look at the third-person plural pronouns. They may be spelled like de and dim, but in colloquial speech, they're both pronounced dom, and sometimes spelled like that too. Finally, looking at the possessive pronouns, some of them are actually further inflected than just what's shown here. For example, min is only the first-person possessive for singular common nouns. For neuter nouns, it's mit, and for all plural nouns, it's mina. The same pattern applies to all first and second person pronouns, as well as to the reflexive one, sin, sit, sina. The other third person pronouns don't inflect for gender and number. They're effectively just nouns with the genitive s ending. Now let's talk about the numbers, and it should be a pretty quick section, so here's 1 through 10. The numbers don't inflect for gender except for one, en or et. Just like the indefinite articles, they're the same word. Swedish numbers don't affect the pluralization of their nouns. To make the 2-digit numbers, you just compound the tens place and the ones place together. Pretty easy, although of course 11 through 19 don't follow this rule. Anyway, to get to the ordinal numbers, most of the time you add some variation of the suffix t to the end. Here's 1st through 10th, and of course you'll see that the first 3 ordinal numbers are the most irregular, especially första, first, and andra, second, which also just means other. Now it's time for the adjectives. Swedish adjectives agree with their noun in gender and number, albeit with only one form in the plural. To form the adjective agreements, you do nothing if the noun is common, add the suffix t if it's neuter, and add the suffix a if it's plural. It should be mentioned that adjectives that end with vowels actually take 2 t's for the neuter ending, like ny becoming nit and blå becoming blått. Also, remember back in the articles when I was giving those example phrases with din and dit? You may have noticed that all the adjectives ended with a. They always do in that situation. Anyway, forming adverbs out of the adjectives is very easy. It's just the neuter form with the exact same t suffix. Finally, Swedish also has comparative and superlative suffixes on adjectives. The comparative, meaning more of the adjective, adds the suffix are like in ny to nyare and bred to bredare, while the superlative, meaning the most, adds the suffix ast like in nyast or bredast. If the superlative is in attributive position, though, it adds the further suffix e, like how the reddest car is den rödaste bilen. It also should be mentioned that some very frequent adjectives have irregular comparative and superlative forms. The word for small is all over the place. For example, its base form is liten, but it has a suppleted inflection for the indefinite plural being small, and the comparative and superlative forms are respectively mindre and minst. Some other examples are god, which becomes bättre and best, dålig, which becomes värre and värst, and finally, bringing root vowel changes back into the mix, stor, which becomes större and störst. So we're now at the verbs, but don't worry, this will be one of the simpler verb sections I've ever done. Swedish infinitive verbs mostly end with a, although for certain short and common verbs, it could be any vowel. For example, a typical verb would be simma or höra, but to show some other vowels, some other Swedish infinitive verbs are se, bli, tro, få, and fly. In addition, to make the verb passive, you can add an s to the end of the form, like for example, höra means hear, but höras means be heard. There are also some verbs without active forms like lyckas, meaning succeed. Anyway, for now, ignoring the verbs that end with random vowels, the infinitives that end with a can be divided into 3 verb classes, but unfortunately you can't tell them apart based on the infinitive. These classes are based on the suffix the verb takes in the present tense, those being the ar class, the er class, and the zero class. But now you may be wondering, which person are these suffixes for? Well, I have some news that will disappoint some of y'all, but will make the rest of y'all very happy. Swedish verbs have no personal agreement whatsoever. Even on common verbs like vara, meaning be, it's always just är in the present. I could show a chart like this, but I don't need to, so I'll just show all the tenses and classes on one chart as I cover them. The regular verbs I'll be using to demonstrate conjugations will be smaka for the adverbs, glömma for the adverbs, föra for the zero-class verbs, and bo for the random vowel class. I'll also use lyckas to demonstrate the passive verbs, but be aware that it's also an adverb. Swedish verbs are primarily only inflected for tense, not really mood or aspect, although we'll get back to that later. Here's the present tense, which kind of explained itself in the class names. We have smakar with the ar ending and glömmer with the er ending. Then there's föra becoming för, which explains why I'm calling it the zero class. There's no suffix in the present tense. The random vowel class simply adds an er to the end of the verb, giving us bor, easy enough. Weirdly, you may think that lyckas would become lyckas in the present, but it doesn't, it just stays as lyckas. Now let's look at the past tense. Of course, there are regular forms in Swedish, that's why I chose these verbs. They vary by class, but all have some form of the de suffix. This gives us respectively smakade, glömde, förde, bodde, and lyckades. However, as is the case with all Germanic languages, Swedish also has a large amount of irregular past tense verbs, which you'll just have to learn. They normally involve some sort of vowel change on the verb, although sometimes it's just the verb without the de ending. To start, here are some common patterns you should know. Vara just becomes var in the past, while göra becomes gjorde. There's also 2 verbs ending with å that end with ik in the past, like gå becoming gick and få becoming fick, although it's not a reliable rule as stå becomes stod and må becomes måtte, which is very close to being regular. Here's an inexhaustive list of them. Another form that's often similar to the past tense is the supine. Like many other European languages in the standard average European Sprachbund, Swedish has a perfective construction expressing that an action had already taken place before something else. This is formed using the verb ha, meaning have, as an auxiliary, conjugated appropriately, and then the supine of the action verb. For the regular verbs, the supine is the same as the past tense form, but you replace the de with t. This gives us smakat, glömt, fört, bott, and lyckats. If you're wondering why I'm saying supine instead of past participle, it's because the past participle form, which is an adjective, is actually different in Swedish. In regular forms, it's similar to the supine, but with a d instead of t. For the irregulars, the supine is, of course, a bit trickier. And what makes it weird is that some verbs which are irregular in the past tense have regular supines. For example, the supine of gå is just got, despite it being gick in the past tense. A lot of others, by far the most common irregular pattern, tend to have irregular participles ending with it, like vara becoming varit, or flyga becoming flygit. Finally, for the verb forms, there's the imperative or the command form. This is pretty easy, although it does vary depending on the verb class. The adverbs, as well as the ones that end with random vowels, stay how they are in the infinitive, which on this chart gives us just smaka, lyckas, and bo. For the other verbs, they remove the infinitive suffix for the imperative form, which gives us glöm and för. The rest of the verbal forms are made by simply putting an auxiliary in front of the infinitive verb. To cover some of the important ones, there's skall, which marks the future tense, but most of the times it's shortened to just ska. From the same root, there's skulle, which marks the conditional mood. There's also måste, meaning must or have to, and bör or borde, meaning should. Finally, there's the verb kunna, which means can, and has the present form of kan and the past form of kunde, as well as the supine of kunnat, and it's also a very important auxiliary verb. The only really important thing left to know about Swedish verbs is the active participle, which is just formed by adding nde to the infinitive verb, and ende if it's the type with a random vowel. This gives us smakande, glömmande, förande, boende, and lyckandes. And to end this section, negation is pretty easy. You just put the negative particle inte after the verb. As for stuff to address about Swedish that didn't fit into any of the above categories, there's the fact that Swedish has two different non-interchangeable words for the conjunction that, and which one to use depends on whether the entire main clause is being connected to the subordinate clause, or just the object from the main clause. I've actually addressed this already in a different video, coincidentally about things that are worth paying attention to in grammar, so I'll just import the example sentences from there. If the entire first clause is being connected, then the word in Swedish is att, as in, jag vet att vi såg filmen tillsammans. Meaning, I know that we saw the movie together. However, if only the object is being connected to the subordinate clause, then the word is som. This sentence would look like jag gillade filmen som vi såg igår, meaning I liked the movie that we saw yesterday. So be aware of that. Now we've officially reached the example sentences as we do to combine all the knowledge gained thus far and see what we can find. The first one is, ska du stanna här efter alla andra har gått? This means, will you stay here after everyone else is gone? First off, as this is a question, the word order is VSO. However, it should be mentioned that since this sentence has an auxiliary verb, only it, ska, moves to the front of the sentence while the action verb stanna stays in its normal spot. Anyway, ska is the future tense auxiliary short for skall, and du is the second person singular subject pronoun. Stanna is the infinitive verb meaning stay, but it only refers to staying in a place. If you want to talk about staying a certain way, you would instead use förbli. Stanna is a completely regular out-of-class verb, by the way. Next, här means here in the locative sense or as a location. This is a distinction Swedish and many other languages make, as in the allative sense, to here the word is hit. Then efter just means after, and alla andra means everyone else. They're both the plural forms of their base words, those being all and annan, respectively. Finally here, har gått is the present perfect form of gå, meaning go. Of those two words, har is the present tense conjugation of ha, meaning have, and then of course, gått is the supine of gå, the action verb. The other example sentence is, det olyckliga biet bar dina resväskor från flygplanet. This means, the unfortunate bee carried your suitcases from the plane. First up is det olyckliga biet, the unfortunate bee. Det is a neuter definite article, but it's only there due to the phrase having an adjective. That adjective is olyckliga, and it's formed from o, a prefix meaning not, and then lycklig, which can be neither happy or lucky, itself made from lycka, meaning luck or joy, and the adjectival suffix li. And then there's the definite suffix. The noun in this phrase is be, the neuter noun meaning be, and it takes the definite article this time as a suffix. Next, bar is the irregular past tense conjugation of bära, meaning carry. Following that is dina resväskor. It has the second person singular possessive pronoun in plural form with the a suffix, and then the common noun resväska, meaning suitcase, in plural form. This is a compound word formed from resa, meaning travel, and väska, meaning bag, so travel bag. By the way, the high pitch from the last syllable in väska didn't survive into the compound word because it moved off the first post-tonic, or the syllable immediately after the stress. However, because it's a compound word, there's high pitch on the e instead. Finally, från is the preposition meaning from, and flygplan is a neuter noun that means plane. It also has the definite article suffix, but no extra word det before it since it's not being modified by an adjective. In the end, svenska är ett intressant språk med mycket erbjuda. Faktiskt hade jag använt svenska ordagcent när jag reste till Sverige 3 år sedan. Fast jag visste inte att ordagcent existerade till senare. Förmodligen hade jag fel för det mesta. Om du gillar komplicerade konjugationer, då kanske ska svenska svika dig. Men fortfarande har språket två genus som man kan inte skilja genom att se deras former. Så du kan uppskatta det. Men om du är rädd för verb i andra språk, och de gör det mardrömmar, då är det här språket för dig. Jag hoppas att ni njöt av den här videon. Om jag gillar att prenumerera, och snart ska jag återvända med en ny video. Tack för att ni tittade.